Romans chapter number 5. There are times I wonder, a lot of times I suppose, on a lot of different things, but what if? You ever wondered the what ifs of life? One of the what ifs that I've thought as I studied through this particular chapter is, what if sin never entered the world? One of the neat things that I've enjoyed with driving and all of that is some of the sights that I've been able to see, sunrises and sunsets. I don't like it when I see the sunrise and then I see the sunset, and I still have hours on both ends of that, but there are times where it's just absolutely beautiful. I know that we could say, well, you know, the sunrises and the sunsets at the beach, and they are pretty over the water, but give me the mountains personally any day, and I'll take and enjoy those sunrises for a short time. But the mountains and the majesty of it, I think there's just something special about that. I had the privilege with my family of just traveling a lot, and I have been in the vast majority of the states. I would like to be in Alaska sometime. I think that would be one of my highlights. I personally want to go fishing in Alaska, and that's just one of those things. And one day, maybe it'll happen. But I've had the opportunity to be in Hawaii and a lot of different states just throughout the U.S. And the vast majority, I figured at one time I've probably been in about 48 or 49 of the 50 states, and Alaska is definitely one I've not been in. And there are some beautiful sections of this great nation. And in spite of all of the beauty that we've been able to see and the beauty that you and I have been able to see, it is all still marred by the effects of sin. The flood and the details of that and what took place to this earth following that are things that you and I have absolutely no clue about. But when God created the Garden of Eden, and I know there are various artists' rendition of what it would have looked like, even then I doubt highly that they've really captured what it actually looked like. The beauty of it, the uniqueness of it. Don't worry about the lion that's right beside you. It's just a big kitty cat. Today, slightly different, okay? You go ahead and worry. It still is a big kitty cat, but it's a big kitty cat with a little bit of a different motive than what they used to have. You go through and think what God's design was. The beauty of the Garden of Eden, I think, had to have been unprecedented. Well, we know it was unprecedented, but our minds would struggle to be able to comprehend what that was like. But you know, there was something even greater than all of that. Mankind enjoyed a relationship with God, such as they have never known since. And I wonder what that was like. When God is seen simply walking through the garden, and the expectation as you read through the account is that Adam and God had this regular fellowship and this regular time. What an amazing thought. If sin had never entered the world, there would be no death. Adam would be one old person by now. And you think through it, death is the result of sin. What was God's original intent and design with all of it? Then I wonder, how long did Adam enjoy this? And I don't know. But they were placed in the Garden of Eden, and they were given this beautiful location with a wonderful fellowship with God. And Adam, in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 17, was given one prohibition, one thing that he could not do. Don't eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because in the day that you eat thereof, you will surely die. The command is very clear. The consequences for disobedience are very clear. And you would think that with that one prohibition, that Adam and Eve would stay as far away as possible from that tree. Why, when you have all of this to be able to enjoy, must you go to that tree? But isn't that the nature of sin? I've said it a number of times, and it maybe helps us. I don't know whether it does or not. It's true regardless. Sin is senseless. It doesn't make sense. And you will frustrate yourself to no end to try to understand what someone was thinking when they committed any kind of sin. What was the rationale behind that? There are various TV shows that indicate some of the dumbest criminal acts possible. And you have to, if you see some of those things, step back and just say, man, what in the world was this guy thinking? Why would you try to rob a bank with a water gun? You know, I mean, it's like, where's the logic in this? And we look at that and say that there is absolutely no sense in it. And all of a sudden, Eve found herself one day, and by the way, when that prohibition was given, Eve was not yet created. That command was given to Adam. And Eve's creation follows a short time thereafter. You can read that in the account of Genesis. Adam was formed. And all of a sudden, Eve is found there by the tree. And Satan, of course, begins questioning and begins sowing doubt. Did God really say this? Begins causing questions to come about in the mind. And all of a sudden, Eve says, well, we're not to eat of it, nor are we to touch it. Nowhere do we find that part of the command. It may be that it was given, but nowhere do we find that. It may be that Adam said, don't eat it. Look, don't even touch it. I don't know. So that we're not to eat of it, nor are we to touch it, because we will die. And at that point in time, Satan just downright defies God and says, ye shall not surely die. And so Eve went ahead and Eve took of that fruit. And Adam was then given an opportunity to obey or disobey. Adam chose to disobey. 1 Timothy chapter number 2 and verse number 14 does not excuse Eve's sin. But the Bible says that Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived was in the transgression. Adam was not deceived. Adam willfully chose to defy God. Because of that, there are certain consequences then that are absolutely inevitable. In fact, God said that in the day that you eat thereof, you are going to die. And the moment they ate, they experienced exactly what God said would take place. Be not deceived, God is not mocked. Whatsoever man soweth, that shall he also reap. You are not going to be the first one in the course of mankind to somehow defy one of God's laws and think that it's not going to happen. Sin inevitably has consequences, just as the earth contains gravity. These are certain laws and these are certain things that God Himself has put into place. As they, or after they sinned, they immediately recognized that something was different. It's interesting, if you were to go and study the account, that Satan told them that they will be as gods, knowing good and evil. They had never known evil prior to this. There was the one part, to an extent, that actually came true. They were not as gods, but they did all of a sudden learn a different element of life. They also learned by experience evil and what it actually entailed. They immediately then recognized the shame. They recognized the fact that they were there naked, and all of a sudden they decided, man, we've got to in some way clothe ourselves, and you find guilt. Never before had mankind ever experienced guilt. This was something that was, in essence, totally foreign to all of creation at this point in time. There was guilt, and they went ahead and attempted to cover that guilt by sewing these fig leaves together. It's interesting when you look at the concept of guilt. There is what we might term as the objective side of guilt. There are people who are not necessarily sorry for what they have done, but they are still guilty. You can look at some criminals and find that they are extremely remorseful over what they have done. There are many others, however, who show absolutely no remorse. I was, for whatever reason, just flipping through the channels the other day and saw one of these shows where prisoners are locked up, and I saw about 30 seconds of it, and I was madder than a hornet when it was all said and done. This guy, what he had done inside his cell, and then the smile that he had on his face walking out. And the whole smile said, nah, I got my way. And man, there's a spiritual side of me that reared up, and I thought, boy, you ought to just sit in all that for the rest of your life. Have fun, buddy. But that was my new nature speaking, and I'm well aware of that. But there was no guilt there. There was no shame, what we might term as the subjective side of guilt. There is an objective side, regardless of whether a person wants to acknowledge it or not. He's guilty. Have you ever been pulled over for speeding? Some of you have. Some of you perhaps never have. One of the first questions that is asked is, after license and registration. That's not a question, that's a command. One of the first questions is, do you know how fast you were going? Right? Okay, now I know who's been pulled over, okay? I've only been told that this is one of the first questions that is asked, but do you know how fast you were going? What's the answer to that? No, I thought, my speedometer must be off. I wonder, how many times does a state trooper hear that? My speedometer's off. Oh, wow. I never even thought about that potential. Never have heard of that excuse in a million years. How many times do we say, yeah, I know exactly. I was running 72 and a 45. Okay? And by the way, there's probably not going to be a lot of questions at that point in time. There might be a statement that says, will you please exit the car, place your hands behind you, and then watch your head as you are sitting in the back of a slightly different vehicle. Nonetheless, there's what you have. I had an opportunity to do a ride around in Utah, and it was pretty fun, actually. And one of these all-night things. It was a lot of fun. And here I am, just riding along, watching bad guys get caught and ticketed and all that stuff, and hearing some of the excuses, and it was quite comical. And all of a sudden, the officer that I was with got called to do a field test, and he was one of the few that was able to do that. And lo and behold, this guy was high or drunk or something. I think he was high on this particular one. And this is going to be cool. We're going to get to even put someone in the back of the car. I don't know why it happens this way, but this is how my luck always works out. Do you realize who ended up in the back of the car and who ended up in the front of the car? I, to this day, don't understand it, but I ended up in the back of the car. The guy who is high on drugs is in the seat where I was sitting, in the front seat. And I don't know why. He explained something. I couldn't get beyond the fact I'm sitting in the back of a police car. And all of these cars that are going by are thinking, wow, there's a guy in the back of the car, along with this other guy who must be doing a ride along. This is backwards, okay? This is the guy right here who's being arrested. I can tell you they didn't care about my legroom back there. It was no, will you please move the wall forward slightly? I don't have enough legroom. Here was the whole point. I'm back riding in this car. Had I done anything wrong? Absolutely not. Was there shame in what I was doing? Well, there was some embarrassment for sure. I didn't do anything wrong, but it's kind of, I wonder what everyone else is thinking. Guilt. There is the objective side of it that says you are guilty whether you sense it or not. And there is the subjective side that emphasizes the shame that oftentimes comes with guilt. When we have looked at the book of Romans, we have divided to this point our study of Romans into two major sections. You have the sinfulness of man. I also phrase it as man's dilemma, and it covered chapter 1, verse 18, all the way through chapter 3 and verse 20. We took the guy who was the pagan Gentile, the one that obviously is a sinner, and we proved that he is without an excuse, even if he never hears the gospel message. We took the moralist, the nice guy next door that you can trust, and indicated that he likewise is a sinner who needs salvation. And then we saw the religious person. Yes, he does all of these ceremonies and so forth, but yet he still needs the righteousness of Jesus Christ. So we emphasize the sinfulness of man, or man's dilemma. That is going to be paralleled in Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 14. Then we began in chapter 3 and verse 21 and saw the righteousness of God. We said that it was God's solution, beginning in chapter 3, verse 21, and continuing down through the end of the chapter here in Romans chapter number 5. That truth is going to be paralleled in Romans chapter 5, verses 15 through 19. Our study is yet to take us into the righteousness of the believer, or we might phrase it as God's expectation. That is going to entail Romans chapter 6 through 8, and it is outlined for us in Romans chapter 5, verses 20 and 21. The entire first 8 chapters are in essence outlined in Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 21. We took some time last time and emphasized a lot of the words and defining them, and now I want to begin looking at some of the logical argument that Paul is very systematically going to go through in this entire passage. Beginning in verse number 12, where the Bible says, "Wherefore as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin. And so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over them that had not sinned after the similitude of Adam's transgression, who is the figure of him that was to come." We're going to stop there. I know we're not going to get beyond that particular point, but as verse number 12 points out, the word wherefore oftentimes is a conclusion that is drawn from previous statements. You might be able to say that in some regards it is based on what was taught through the righteousness of God. Therefore, what we have as being justified by faith, and then also, therefore, this is the elements of sin in the world. I think that it's probably better instead of pointing that actually ahead to show the contrast that is going to exist between Adam's disobedience and Christ's obedience. We saw, and I have a handout still on the back table to my knowledge, detailing a study of contrast in Romans chapter 5. If you didn't get that last week, I would encourage you to grab one there at the back. Another point that you could add to that are two different trees. Adam's tree, the one that he was told not to eat of, and then you think of the cross. a vastly different tree. You may want to jot that down if you so choose. If not, that's fine as well. But as he continues on now, I mentioned there are certain statements that are going to be what we might term as declarations. And what begins to take place now is these declarations start being issued. There are two very logical statements that are going to begin to follow. They're introduced by the word as and so. As by one man sin entered the world, death by sin. Now, here's the second one. So death passed upon all men. But in doing so, Paul begins to make certain declarations. What are these declarations? Number one, sin entered into the world. Wherefore, as by one man, sin entered into the world. Here is the first declaration. Sin entered into the world by one man. You can go and read the account of Genesis chapters 2 and 3, and I've already shared much of that, but it was very clear in Genesis chapter 2, verses 16 and 17, that Adam and Eve were not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But all of a sudden, they chose to, and Adam willfully disobeyed God, and because he did that, sin entered the world. This is a concept, and a lot of people ask the questions today, why are things as bad as they are? And people begin to look at situations that are going on in the Middle East, situations that are occurring even here in the United States. This is a very common question for an unsaved person to ask. Why is it that things are this bad? Here, as a believer, is an absolutely phenomenal answer to give them. Here's the problem. The problem is that sin entered the world. Now, keep in mind that the word sin here is singular. It's emphasizing the nature of sin, not necessarily emphasizing individual acts of sin. Now, Adam was not the first person to sin. Satan and the fallen angels had already sinned. But it was Adam's sin that brought sin into the entire world. Now, do you think that Adam ever at any point understood all of the consequences of his disobedience? Do you think that Adam thought and recognized that the effects of his disobedience would be that far-reaching? I dare say he probably did not. But let me point out that oftentimes believers mistakenly conclude that their sin does not affect anyone else and that it only affects them. Wrong, wrong, wrong. Wrong on all sorts of levels. It does not only affect you. You are not an island to yourself, and sin inevitably has far-reaching consequences, many of which we often ever fail to see and consider. Adam's disobedience brought sin into the world. There's the first declaration. Here's the second declaration. Death entered, we would understand it, by sin. Sin entered into the world by one man, and death, we could put in parentheses, entered by sin. Why do people die? Sin. That's the reason. Now, well, that's kind of harsh to explain. Well, it's the fact. Okay? You have an appointment with death. Unless the rapture takes place, everyone in here is going to experience the reality of death. The death that is spoken of here, I believe, is primarily a physical death, but it stands to reason that the spiritual death and eternal death could certainly also be in view. God told Adam, Genesis chapter 2 and verse 17, "In the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die." Romans chapter 6, verse 23, "The wages of sin is death." Twice in Ezekiel chapter 18, once in verse 4 and once in verse 20, Ezekiel stated, "The soul that sinneth, it shall die." The consequence of sin is death. Now, Satan came along and told Eve, "No, you're not going to die." He directly contradicted exactly what God said. You're not going to die. But the very moment that Adam sinned, death immediately entered the world. The word by suggests here that it's the means by which death came into the world. Death was never God's intent. But man chose this consequence when man chose to sin. Wherefore, as by one man, sin entered into the world. Adam's sin, or Adam's disobedience, brought sin into the entire world. Second declaration is that death entered the world by means of sin. Here's the third declaration. Death passed upon all men. We might say, just as genetic characteristics are passed on to descendants, the spiritual consequences of sin have also been passed upon all men. There are some people who will look there and look at a child and say, wow, he's got your nose. I've never been able to see those types of things. Never. You maybe can or maybe you can't. It's like, well, okay, yeah, it comes down, it's got 2 holes. Wow, they've got, now I can tell eyes, that's just because they're color, wow, he's got your ears. Your ears, what's so special about that? I mean, it's obvious, I guess, if they're stuck straight out or something like that, or Dumbo and the elephant and all the huge ears. I mean, those types of things are obvious, but I can't look at something. I mean, I've never heard him say, wow, he's got your hands. 5 fingers. Wow, I mean, he's got your toes. These are genetic characteristics that are passed upon all men. In that same way, the spiritual consequences also have. And aside from the rapture, death is something that all men are going to face. Death is no respecter of persons. It will take the wealthy as well as the poor. It will take the healthy as well as the diseased. It takes the young as well as the old. Why? Because sin entered into the world. Now, the reason that death is passed upon all men is explained for us at the end of verse number 12. For that all have sinned. Here is the logical conclusion that's explained, because every person with no exception has sinned. We've already stated this, and we've already established this. Romans chapter 3, verse 23. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. There is a reality that has taken place. Because all have sinned, all have to experience the consequences of sin. In case you haven't figured it out yet, you are a descendant of Adam. Okay? This is reality. You might be able to trace your lineage back to who knows who, and you might go back to some ancestors who swung by trees in all sorts of different ways, and you go back, but it's ultimately going back to Adam. In a sense, therefore, all were present when Adam sinned by nature. And because of that, all experience death because all have sinned. Now, let me not point out that an individual is not a sinner because he sins. He is a sinner first, and therefore he sins. Okay? There's this kind of idea that's there. The guy's, he's already guilty. The teenager will ask, don't you trust me? No. Okay? You are already guilty. You maybe grew up in a home where you had 2 strikes against you, if not 3 already. If there was any kind of an accusation made, you were guilty. It's the way it was in my home frequently. I felt I had 2 strikes already against me, and the 3rd pitch was already on the way. You know why? Probably because I was guilty. There were a few times I wasn't, but those were vast and very rare and very difficult to ever prove that I was actually not responsible for that particular thing. But individual acts of sin do not give someone a sin nature. He's born with a sin nature, and he therefore acts in accordance with his nature. A newborn child has a sin nature. They demand. They are highly impatient. They are at times highly irritable. Okay? They have certain expectations and certain ideas of when things are supposed to take place, and these things are very clearly expressed in how they feel. They're sinners. That cute little baby in the hospital is a sinner. That ugly little baby in the hospital is a sinner. So, oh man, you can't say that. I'm saying what every guy has thought, okay? The lady said, oh, he's so cute. And you're thinking, oh. Yeah, okay. But nonetheless, those children are all sinners. That's their nature. Now, beginning then in verse 13, and you'll see at the beginning of it, the parentheses, it goes all the way down through verse number 17. So the thought of verse number 12, all have sinned, now is actually continued all the way down in verse 18. Notice, and we'll skip verses 13 through 17. Verse 12, wherefore as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. Therefore, as by the offense of one judgment came upon all men to condemnation, even so by the righteousness of one the free gift came upon all men unto justification of life. The contrast and the conclusions of verse 12 are actually going to be stated all the way down in verse number 18. So verses 13 through 17 are what we term as a parenthetical section. There is a thought that is put in there. Someone might immediately protest what Paul is saying, protest the declaration that, and by the way, you protest all you want, but it's to no avail. Protest, you know what? I wasn't there when Adam sinned. It's not fair for me to get thrown into that category. All right, look at verse number 13. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over them that had not sinned after the similitude of Adam's transgression, who is the figure of him that was to come. The thrust of Paul's entire argument, by the way, is actually seen in the acceptance of what God has stated regarding Adam. If you reject what God has said regarding Adam, then you have to, by logic, reject what he is stating about Jesus Christ. Prior to the giving of the law on Mount Sinai, did sin exist? Yes. Now, there is a vast period of time historically that takes place between the time that Adam and Eve were created and the time when the actual law ends up being given. Turn back, if you will, to the book of Genesis chapter number 5. Genesis chapter number 5, there are several passages that are genealogical in their nature. Genesis 5 is one of them. Genesis 10 is another one. And in Genesis chapter number 5, you are going to find a recurring theme. You'll find several of them, but one is really, really clear. The other one is pretty interesting as well. These people lived a long time prior to the flood. Adam, for example, lived in 130 years in verse 3 and begat a son in his own likeness named Seth. Wow. 130 years old, and you have a child. 130 years old is a long period. A real long time to start having children. After he begat Seth, he lived 800 years. All the days that Adam lived, 930 years. Man, go back 930 years from this point. Adam would be a historian like you've never seen. Okay? Adam truly would have been around in the Dark Ages. And we joke with some people, oh man, what was it like in the Dark Ages? Adam would have been able to have told you. Okay? Adam would have lived through so much, 930 years. But what does the end of verse number 5 state? And he died. Well, then you go to Seth, and he lived, according to verse number 8, 912 years. Then what? He died. Then you go down to Enos, and verse 11, he was only 905. He died kind of young. He died. Verse number 14, he died. Verse 17, he died. Verse 20, he died. Verse 22, or verse 24 rather, he did not die. Kind of an interesting one, Enoch. Drop on down to verse 27, he died. Verse 31, he died. Had the law been given? No, but they died. Why did they die? They died because sin was in the world. You find this recurring theme. By the way, you are going to die. I know it's encouraging. Okay? If you haven't been lifted up yet, then sometime you'll be let down, but nonetheless, that's a bad joke. But anyway, I just got to stop doing stuff like that. But anyway, you are going to end up dying. This is the reality of what it is that's going to take place. Why? Because according to Romans chapter 5, sin entered into the world. Now, let's turn back into Romans 5. Until the time when the law was actually given, sin was in the world. Sin existed in the world from the very moment that Adam and Eve sinned. It existed all throughout this time frame, even though the law had not been given. Verse 13 continues by saying, "But sin is not imputed when there is no law." Sin or death, and we might say the argument is this, that death is not the result of breaking the 10 Commandments. It is not the result of committing certain sins. It is the result of sin in general. We talked about the comparison between a sin nature and the act of sin. It's not because you lied that you are going to die. You are going to die because you are a sinner. He says that sin is not imputed when there is no law. Sin does not come along and is not placed on someone's account. We've talked about this term before. We used it to describe the righteousness of Jesus Christ that was placed on our account. Now, the whole point of what he is saying then is that sin is not imputed when there is no law. You cannot put sin on someone's account if there is no law. How do you charge someone with breaking a law that does not exist? You can't. But they still died. Why did they die? Because sin entered into the world. So when the law was given, does that mean that prior to the law they were innocent? No. Why do we know that? They died. They couldn't be innocent. So then after the law, what changed? After the law, what changed is the awareness of sin. Now all of a sudden there's a standard that we are consciously going to be breaking. But still, sin existed, and we know that sin existed in the world because according to verse 14, death reigned from Adam to Moses. Adam being the one who first sinned, Moses being when the law ends up being given. You say, well, you know what? It's not unfair because I wasn't there. And we already talked about this fact that Adam is your great, ridiculously great-grandfather. Okay? On a level that is infinitely higher than you will ever have time to calculate. You are a descendant, so in a sense, you were there. But you say, well, if I had been there, I wouldn't have done that. Well, brother, yeah, you would have. Okay? You'd have probably done it sooner, to be honest with you. But nonetheless, what if it's unfair, and here's the argument, it's unfair because I didn't disobey as Adam disobeyed. Death reigned from Adam to Moses, Even a word that is pointing out the fact that we want to keep this to the same group of people. Okay? We're talking about the group of people from Adam to Moses. The word even says we need to keep the focus there. Not talking about people after the law. Forget that point. Let's talk just about the people who existed between Adam and Moses. They all died. Did they all sin in the same way that Adam sinned? No. Even over them that had not sinned after the similitude of Adam's transgression. In other words, this is the group of people. We're still talking from Adam to Moses. Adam disobeyed a very specific command. These people did not violate that same specific command. They did not necessarily go to this tree. Of course, we know that once they sinned, the cherub was put outside. Man was no longer able to enter into the Garden of Eden. But they didn't go and say, oh, wow, here, let me have this and eat it. Did they still sin? Yes. Did they sin in the exact same manner that Adam did? No. But they still sinned. How do we know that? Because death still descended on them. Death still reigned even over them that had not sinned after the similitude or after the same manner of Adam's transgression. Notice this, at the end of verse number 14, who is the figure of him that was to come. The word figure suggests a type or a pattern. If you were to study types in the Word of God, you would find there's a type and there's an antitype. Doesn't mean that someone contrary to the type. It means someone who is the fulfillment of that type. Adam is the type. Who is the antitype? Who is the fulfillment? Jesus Christ. Anytime you study types and antitypes and some of the stuff we talk about more in the Old Testament, and you end up with certain pictures, so to speak, that are there in the Old Testament that have a greater meaning yet to come. That's what you have with Adam and Jesus Christ. That's a type. The antitype is over here. The antitype, or the fulfillment of that type, is actually what is to receive the attention. Here's the truth of what is being stated at the end of verse number 14. Adam sinned. He is the type of him that was to come, referencing Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the antitype. Jesus Christ is the one to whom the picture is to focus on. Sin entered the world. Jesus Christ entered the world to pay the penalty of sin. And it's an amazing truth. Who gets the credit? Jesus Christ, not Adam. Turn, if you will, to the book of 1 Corinthians chapter number 15. You'll see this same analogy given here. 1 Corinthians chapter number 15, if you'll note there, and beginning in verse number 45, you'll see the same comparison, the similar language being used. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the argument is going along the lines of the resurrection of the body. Did Jesus Christ rise? Absolutely. And therefore, those who are His can expect to be resurrected as well. Notice verse number 45. And so it is written, the first man, Adam, was made a living soul. This is referencing the Adam. The last Adam, who would that be? Christ, was made a quickening spirit. Howbeit, that was not first which is spiritual, but that which is natural, and afterward that which is spiritual. Adam was the natural, a physical person. Jesus Christ on the spiritual. The first man is of the earth. I like this. Earthy. Okay? What's that mean? He came from the earth. He came from the dust. And where did he return? To the dust. Okay? As beautiful as you are nothing more than a lump of clay. Okay? And you're going to not look so nice after you die. The second man is not that. He is spiritual. He is the Lord from heaven. As is the earthy, such are they also that are earthy. That's you and I. what's going to happen? We're going to die. And unto dust we are going to return. And as is the heavenly, such are they also that are heavenly. We are, in the context, going to be resurrected with Jesus Christ. And as we have borne the image of the earthy, Adam, we shall also bear the image of the heavenly, Jesus Christ. Because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, you and I are guaranteed the completion of our salvation. It's an amazing thing. That is what is taught in 1 Corinthians chapter 15. No wonder he's able to go down all the way to verse 55 and say, O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? It doesn't exist because you and I have placed our trust in Jesus Christ, and we will therefore be ascended with him forever to reign. And so the focus in Romans chapter 5, verses 12 through 14 is on the mess that Adam created. It parallels very well with Romans 1:18 through 3:20. Man has a dilemma. You and I are sinners. Because of sin, death has entered into the world. Death, here's another declaration, has passed upon all men. Why? Because all have sinned. What about the people who were alive before the law was given? They all died. Therefore, they all sinned. Did they have to sin in the exact same manner that Adam did to receive the same consequence of Adam? No, because they sinned. Adam, who is the father of us all, has sinned, and that sin nature has been passed on to you and to me. But thank God for his grace. Because the situation in Romans 5:12 through 14 is as dismal as what is portrayed in Romans 1:18 through 3:20. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. But Jesus Christ and his love and God in his grace provided a way for mankind to be redeemed from this curse. And it's an absolutely wonderful picture. That is the message that is yet to come. I don't know how much you ponder on the grace of God, but I want to encourage you to ponder a lot on it. God is an amazing God, and he is so gracious. His love for us is beyond our comprehension, as Romans chapter 8 is going to allude to. And grace, by its very definition, is something that is undeserving. You and I, tonight, and to my knowledge, everyone here has placed their trust in Jesus Christ. You and I are in a position that we don't deserve. I'm not sure if you realize that or not. I hope you do. We are in a position that we don't deserve. We serve an amazing and gracious God. God said, don't eat of this. Adam said, I'm going to. And by his act of disobedience, plunged all of mankind into sin. God could very well have said, I told you not to do it, and you did it anyway. But God said, I told you not to do it. You did it anyway. Let me pay the price to get you out of it. And to me, against the backdrop of sin, as black as it is, and when you read passages such as Romans 5:12 through 14, the grace of God shines so much brighter. And it is an absolutely amazing truth. The focus is going to begin to change in verse 15. To not emphasize the sin of Adam, but instead to emphasize now the gift of God. And that's going to become the focus of verses 15 through 18, and we'll look at that next Sunday. Let's